Chapter 1. The Spark in the Filth. The tunnels had collapsed weeks ago, sealing off the lower burrows of the Underhive like a tomb. The air was thick with mold and the stench of wet fur. Stagnant pools of warp-tainted water shimmered faintly in the dark, catching the glow from dying warp lamps that still clung to the walls. Beneath the twisted steel and fractured rock, shapes moved. Small, desperate, hungry. Skritch Quickfang moved among them, one paw clutching a flickering lantern, powered by a cracked warp battery. The green light hissed, casting long shadows that seemed to breathe. He was small for his kind, even by Skaven standards, all ribs and stringy muscle under patchwork robes slick with filth. His whiskers twitched constantly, tasting the damp air for the scent of danger or opportunity. Down here, they were the same thing. The collapse had buried an entire workshop complex belonging to Clan Skry, and rumor whispered that precious Warpstone had been lost beneath the rubble. The higher engineers and warlocks wouldn't risk their hides sifting through unstable tunnels, but the runts and refuse of the clan had no such luxury. They scurried like cockroaches, hoping to claw up a fragment of fortune before the fumes or something worse claimed them. Skritch picked through debris with a bent length of rebar, scraping rust and dust away from shattered brass. Dead rats, the smaller, mindless kind, floated in the pools around him, swollen and luminous from radiation. Every step was a risk. The floor shifted underfoot with the groan of unstable stone, and occasionally a gust of fetid air would blow through, hot and sweet with rot. Somewhere deeper, a generator still hummed weakly, its death rattle echoing through the hollow bones of the Undercity. He found it by accident. The tunnel wall had caved in on one side, revealing a cavity behind, an unnatural space where the rock had melted smooth and glassy. The edges glowed faintly, as if scorched by warp fire. Something inside pulsed with a sickly rhythm, green and crimson light leaking through the dust. The glow drew Skritch forward like a moth to a flame. He dropped to his knees, scraping away the ash until his claws touched something warm, flesh, but not quite. He pulled harder, hissing with the effort, and a lump came free with a wet tearing sound. It was the size of a rat's skull, irregular and still glistening. Warpstone veins laced through it, webbing over a core of blackened orc flesh, muscle and sinew hardened into something crystalline. It pulsed once, twice, then went still in his paws. Skritchy's heart hammered. Warpstone was precious, dangerous, holy in its own way. But this was different. The shard hummed faintly, as though it recognized being touched. When he brought it closer to his lamp, it shimmered between shades of green and deep oily red. Faint whispers stirred in his ears, not words, but the suggestion of them. A guttural voice, heavy and brutal, pressing against his mind like a hammer on soft wax. He flinched, almost dropping it. The light in the tunnel flickered, the warp batter screaming in protest. For a moment, the whole chamber seemed to breathe. The puddles rippled, the air grew hot, and something deep beneath his feet thudded, once, like the heartbeat of the earth. Then it was gone. The silence returned, broken only by the soft drip of water. He looked down at the shard. Its glow had dimmed, settling into a steady pulse that matched his own heartbeat. The flesh around the warpstone had hardened again, but it looked different now, slicker, as if freshly bled. Skritch hesitated, then wrapped it in a strip of cloth torn from his robe and shoved it into his satchel. He would show no one, not yet. Not until he understood what it was and what it could do. As he turned to leave, something moved at the edge of the light. A dead rat twitched, then another. Their eyes glowed faintly green. The corpses began to stir, tails lashing weakly, teeth chattering in unison. Skritch froze, his breath catching in his throat. The shard in his bag pulsed faster, brighter. The rats clawed at the ground, scraping at the stone as though trying to dig toward him. Then, just as suddenly, they went still again, limp and lifeless. He ran. The tunnel seemed to twist around him, narrowing with each frantic step. Shadows lengthened, following close behind, whispering in languages he didn't understand. His lamp guttered, flaring violently before dying altogether, leaving only the $14.99 green glow from his satchel. It lit his face from below, throwing his sharp features into monstrous relief. His teeth were bared in a grin that was not entirely his own. When he finally crawled back into the relative safety of the scavenger tunnels, he was shaking. The others were asleep, curled in nests of shredded rags. He slipped past them, found his hollow in the wall, and sealed himself inside. The air was stale and warm, but it felt safe. For now. He took the shard out again. It pulsed softly, like something alive. He couldn't stop staring at it. The way the veins of Warpstone moved beneath the surface, alive, shifting, almost breathing, was mesmerizing. He thought of the higher engineers, of their power, their weapons, their lightning-wreathed claws. With this, perhaps, he could join them? Perhaps he could rule them? He pressed it to his chest. The heat of it seeped into his fur, through the skin, into the meat beneath. He didn't notice when his claws began to tremble, or when his whiskers twitched in rhythm with the shard's pulse. His eyes fluttered closed, and sleep came fast, dark and heavy. Outside his chamber, the vermin began to stir again. Their eyes shone with the same $14.99 green light. They crawled closer, circling the hollow where Skritch slept, tails twitching, tiny teeth chattering in a low, rhythmic pattern. The shard in his arms throbbed once, sending a faint pulse through the tunnels, a soundless vibration that set the water trembling and drew every rat in the burrow to stillness. In the dark, Skritch smiled in his sleep. The shard whispered back. Chapter 2. Claws in the Shadows. The days that followed blurred into a haze of fumes and shadow. Skritch rose before the tunnel lamps flickered to life, and worked long after they died again, his paws blackened with soot and ash, his fur matted with oil and blood. The burrow labs of Clan Scryer were always awake, always hungry. Vast industrial warrens of pipes, furnaces, and humming warp generators, where thousands of lesser engineers toiled under the ever-watchful eyes of their masters. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and burning copper, and every breath tasted faintly of madness. He had learned quickly where power flowed in such places, not through skill but through possession. Those who controlled the Warpstone, who hoarded and sold it, controlled everything. So he began to trade in scraps. Not the kind that might draw suspicion, not yet. Just the flecks that gathered on the floors of smelters and reactors, the dust brushed from the robes of higher engineers. He sold them quietly to pit fighters, to poison brewers, to the priests of Clan Pestilence who came crawling through the tunnels in the dead of night. Every deal bought him a little more respect, a little more food, and a little more room to move without being stepped on. And always, hidden beneath the rags he wore, was the shard. It had become a part of him now. He kept it wrapped tight against his chest, and when he touched it, it pulsed in answer. Not cold like stone, but warm, living, aware. Sometimes he thought it was breathing. Other times he swore it was listening. At first, the whispers were faint, indistinct. They came in dreams, flashes of violence, roaring laughter, the thunder of drums somewhere deep below the earth. But with each passing day they grew clearer. When he worked, the shard seemed to hum in time with the machines around him, vibrating against his ribs. He found himself anticipating the movement of gears before they shifted, seeing the patterns of energy through the air as though drawn in light. He began to build things. Small things at first, modifications to his tools, refinements to the capacitor rods, repairs made in ways the manuals never described. His machines ran hotter, faster, more efficiently. His superiors noticed. The overseer of the section, Warlock Greenzit, began to take an interest. Greenzkin was a thick-set brute, his fur patchy with burn scars, his eyes bright as coals. He had long ago replaced his left arm with a mechanical claw, heavy and cruel, powered by warp energy that hissed faintly with every movement. His temper was infamous, his cruelty worse. But even he could not ignore results, and Skritch's machines were beginning to outshine those of his peers. The promotions came slowly, quietly. A better place at the forges, a key to the reagent stores, a name spoken without derision in the common burrows. Each step up the ladder felt like another thread pulled tight inside his skull. The shard pulsed harder, and the voice grew louder. It whispered not in words, but in impulses. Hunger, cunning, ambition. He found himself smiling at thoughts that once would have frightened him. Thoughts of power, of command, of others bowing. He began experimenting after hours, when the forges went cold. The laboratory tunnels were never truly silent. There was always the drip of condensation, the faint hum of machinery far below, but this deep into the warrens few dared to wander. He stole warped components and discarded scrap, melting them down into crude apparatuses. The shard responded to the attention like a living thing, glowing brighter as he worked, its inner veins shifting and rearranging. Sometimes, when he placed it near the warp energy conduits, it drank the light, leaching power from the machines until the pipes groaned and the air stank of ozone. Once, he accidentally dropped a drop of his own blood upon it. The shard pulsed violently, and the droplet evaporated into steam that coiled into the shape of a claw before vanishing. After that, he began to feed it deliberately, just a little, a cut on the paw, a smear on its surface. Each time the whisper grew stronger. Each time he understood a little more of what it wanted. But secrets in the Underhive never stayed buried long. Greenzkin began to watch him. At first it was just suspicion. The overseer would appear behind him at odd hours, his mechanical claw ticking softly as he loomed, pretending to examine Skritch's work. Then came the questions, too casual to be harmless. Where had he learned that technique? Where 999 he find the energy to work so long? What fuel source was he using? Skritch deflected each one with careful humility, but he could feel the tension coiling tighter each day. When the thefts from the Warpstone stores were discovered, Greenzkin didn't bother with words. He sent his enforcers first, 3 burly lab hands with augmetic limbs and the cold eyes of those who had seen too many executions. They cornered Skritch in the storage tunnels, claws clicking, blades glinting in the pale green light. He didn't remember much of the fight, only flashes, sparks flying as metal met metal, the crunch of bone, the smell of burning fur. He moved faster than he ever had before, every motion guided by something other than thought, the shard pulsing like a heartbeat against his chest, feeding energy through him. When it was over, he was standing alone, panting, surrounded by twisted corpses that smoked faintly in the air. The shard was glowing. By the time Greenzkin confronted him, the whispers had turned into a steady roar. The overseer's laboratory was a cathedral of steel and wire, filled with hanging chains and the scent of old blood. Generators pulsed with green light, throwing jagged shadows across the walls. Greenzkin stood at the far end, his claw extended, crackling with warp energy. "Stealing from me," he hissed, voice low and tremulous with rage. "Stealing from me, from my stores, my forges, my warlocks." Skritch said nothing. His paw drifted toward the shard beneath his robe. The light from it bled through the fabric, casting an eerie glow across his chest. Greenzkin saw it, and his snarl turned to a leer. "Ah, there it is. Your secret." He took a step forward, the claw flexing. "You think you're clever. You think you can steal from me and hide it. But that thing belongs to Clan Skryre, and to me." He lunged. The fight was chaos. Warp energy tore through the air in crackling bolts, scorching metal and stone. Skritch ducked beneath one blast, the heat searing the fur from his arm. He moved like an animal, faster and wilder than he had ever been. Greasett's claw tore through the wall where he had stood a heartbeat before, shearing off a section of pipe that screamed as it bent. Skritch grabbed a fallen rod and swung it, connecting with the overseer's side. Sparks flew. The blow dented metal, but Greasett barely staggered. He turned, eyes burning with fury, and caught Skritch by the throat, lifting him from the ground. "Thief," he snarled. 100 flay your hide and feed it to the reactors." The shard burned against Skritch's chest. He felt it pulling at him, drawing something out, rage, fear, desperation, twisting them together into a single, blinding surge. Without thinking, he slammed his palm against Greasett's arm. The shard flared through his ribs, through his arm, into the overseer's flesh. Light exploded. Greasett screamed, his mechanical limbs sparking wildly as warp energy overloaded its circuits. His fur smote, his eyes rolled back. The energy tore through his body, bursting veins and boiling blood. When it ended, he fell, a smoking ruin of metal and meat. Skritch staggered back, gasping, the air thick with the stench of ozone and burnt flesh. The shard had dimmed again, but its pulse was steady, stronger now, brighter. He looked down and saw that Greasett's corpse was sinking, its flesh melting away into a black slurry that flowed toward him, toward the shard, vanishing into it. The light grew. He felt its warmth spreading through him, filling every nerve, every vein. The whispers in his mind turned to laughter, deep, booming laughter that echoed like the sound of drums in the dark. Skritch smiled faintly, though his lips were split and bleeding. He looked at the smoldering corpse, then at the glowing shard. Power, he realized, wasn't given, it was taken. And he was done being small. Chapter 3. The Slave Pits. The stink of greenskins hung over the lower warrens like rot. It wasn't a single smell, but 1,000 layered ones, sweat and iron, dung and fungus, the heavy sweet tang of half-healed wounds. Even among the choking fumes of the Skaven forges, it stood out. It clung to the fur and the throat. It sank into the stone. Skritch Quickfang had learned to breathe through his teeth to keep from gagging. He wore a mask of brass and leather that filtered out the worst of it, but nothing could mute the sounds, the endless chorus of snarling, clanging, howling things caged in the dark. The greenskin pens stretched for hundreds of feet through the tunnels beneath the warlock workshops, their iron bars and rusted gates forming a labyrinth of cages, stacked like honeycomb. Each was crammed with orcs, goblins, or the broken remnants of both, packed so tight they could hardly move. The air buzzed with energy, not magic exactly, but something older, dumber, rawer, the violent hum of the Waaagh-Rat that lived in every greenskin heart. Even half-starved, even beaten, they radiated defiance. The Skaven used them for labor, for pit fighting, and sometimes simply for amusement. It was said they could never truly be tamed, only chained until their spirit broke, and even then, it never stayed broken for long. Skritch's promotion had been unexpected. After Greasett's accidental demise, the hierarchy above him had shifted like quicksand, and in the chaos, his name had found its way onto the slate of overseers. The council favored results, and Skritch's innovations in warp energy stabilization had caught their attention. For that, he was rewarded not with a laboratory, but with responsibility for the slave pens, a place where engineers tested new control methods on living flesh. He had accepted without hesitation. The shard pulsed warmly against his chest as he walked the narrow metal walkways above the cages. He could feel it feeding, faintly, on the Waaagh energy below. The greenskins seemed to sense it, too, their heads turned to follow him as he passed, their red eyes gleaming in the dark. Some snarled. Others grew oddly quiet. At the far end of the pits was a reinforced enclosure twice the size of the others. The walls were lined with rune-inscribed copper and bolted iron, each plate etched with sigils of containment. Inside squatted a single figure, huge, motionless, shackled by chains thicker than Skritch's arms. His green skin was mottled with black and purple veins that pulsed faintly with light. One eye glowed with an unnatural gleam, like a burning coal. The guards called him Grudnash da Unkillable. He had been captured during a raid on the surface, dragged down screaming into the tunnels and half drowned in Wyrdstone dust. Where others would have withered or exploded in mutation, Grubnash had survived. His flesh had warped, but not broken, muscles bulging, bones fusing into armor-like ridges. He bore scars from claws, blades, and warp flame alike, but he still lived. He had killed 4 handlers during his first week in captivity. Since then, no one had dared enter his cage. Skritch stood before the gate, studying him. The orc's head was lowered, his breathing slow and deep, like a bellows at rest. Chains ran from his limbs to the floor, rattling faintly with every movement. Skritch's lantern flickered, casting green light across the brute's hide. The flesh shimmered, the veins glowed. There was power there, raw, unrefined, waiting to be drawn out. He felt the shard respond. It throbbed against his chest, faster, hungrier. Skritch smiled behind his mask. He ordered the guards to open the gate. They hesitated, exchanged looks, and obeyed. The iron door screeched open on rusted hinges, the sound echoing down the corridor. Skritch stepped inside alone, his boots sinking into the grime. The air inside was hot and thick, full of the scent of blood and ozone. Grubnash didn't move. Skritch approached slowly, pulling a length of wire and a small capacitor from his belt. He connected the two to a brass prod and charged it with a flick of his claw. Warp light crackled along the rod, casting jagged shadows across the chamber. He circled the orc, studying the unnatural growths that bulged along its shoulders and spine. They looked almost crystalline, as if the Wyrdstone had fused with his flesh. When he touched the prod to Grubnash's back, the reaction was instantaneous. The orc roared, a sound like an avalanche, and surged forward, the chains jerking taut. The force nearly threw Skritch off his feet. The ground shook. The sound reverberated through the tunnel network, rattling dust from the ceiling. Grubnash strained against the shackles, muscles bulging, eyes blazing with fury. The prod sparked uselessly in Skritch's grip, overwhelmed by the brute's raw strength. Then the shard flared. The light from his chest spilled out in a sudden pulse, flooding the cage with green fire. The noise stopped. For a heartbeat, everything was frozen. The orc 1499 snarl, Skritch 1499 breath. The light stretched between them like a thread, thin and shimmering, connecting his heart to the creature's eye. It wasn't just light. It was thought. Awareness. Something reached into Skritch's mind. A weight, immense and brutal, pressed down upon him. Images flashed behind his eyes, fields of war, screaming banners, the crush of combat, the taste of blood and mud. He felt the hunger of the orc's soul, the endless need to fight, to kill, to win, and beneath that a strange curiosity. Who? You. The voice wasn't heard so much as felt. It scraped against his thoughts like a blade over bone. Skritch staggered back, clutching his head. The shard pulsed again, stronger. For a moment, he wasn't sure which heartbeat was his, the one thudding in his chest, or the deeper, heavier rhythm of Grubnash's. He could feel the orc's rage, his pain, his hunger. It was like standing at the edge of a storm and realizing the wind was inside his skull. He forced himself upright. "You are mine," he said quietly. "My subject, my experiment." The orc blinked slowly. The glow in his eye dimmed, then brightened again. "No." The voice was clearer now, rough and mocking. "You smell weak, small. The insult cut like a knife. Skritch raised the prod and struck him again, harder this time. Warp light crackled, burning the orc's flesh, but the brute only laughed, a deep, booming sound that shook the walls. Skritch felt something twist inside him. Fury, yes, but also exhilaration. The shard was alive between them now, vibrating like a plucked string. He could feel the orc's laughter in his chest, and Grubnash, he realized, could feel his hatred. He pressed the prod to the creature's neck, pouring power into it. The light turned white-hot. The smell of scorched flesh filled the air. Grubnash convulsed, teeth bared. But the laughter didn't stop. It turned to something else. Not joy, not pain, but recognition. Their minds locked fully. For a heartbeat, Skritch was in another body, vast, monstrous, pulsing with strength. He saw himself through Grubnash's eyes, a small, twitching shape of fur and greed, holding a stick of lightning. And beneath the contempt there was understanding. The orc knew what Skritch wanted: power, command, the right to crush and rule. "We want the same," the voice growled. "You and me." The vision broke like glass. Skritch staggered back, gasping, sweat dripping down his spine. The shard had gone dark. The light sucked inward until only a faint pulse remained. Grubnash sagged against his chains, breathing heavily, smoke curling from the burns along his skin. The guards peered in, uncertain. "He's quiet now," one said. Skritch didn't answer. He watched the orc for a long time, studying the rise and fall of his chest, the faint gleam of Wyrdstone in his veins. Their connection still hummed, faint but constant, a presence at the edge of thought. He could feel Grubnash's mind, lurking like a predator in the dark, and he knew the orc could feel him too. When he left the pit, the shard was still warm against his skin. It beat with a slow, heavy rhythm that no longer matched his own. He walked through the tunnels in silence, the sound of the slave pens echoing behind him, the roar of beasts, the clank of chains, and somewhere beneath it all, the low, rhythmic laughter of something vast and unstoppable. That night, as he lay in his cell, Skritch dreamed of war drums and green fire. And when he woke, he realized the laughter had followed him into his mind. Chapter 4. Stirring the Wand. The first sign came as a vibration, faint, rhythmic, so low it might have been the rumble of distant forges. But as the hours passed, the sound grew. It rolled through the tunnels like the murmur of an awakening beast, a pulse that made dust tremble on the beams and lanterns sway on their hooks. Skritch Quickfang woke to it in the middle of the night. His quarters were small, a hollow carved into the rock beside the lower forges, its air heavy with fumes and the constant hum of warp generators. The shard on his chest burned hot against his fur, its pulse matching the deep thrum echoing through the walls. He sat upright, heart pounding, the taste of copper thick on his tongue. For a moment he thought it was only his imagination, the lingering echo of dreams, until he heard the distant roar. A guttural, animal sound, rising from the slave pits far below. He threw on his coat and mask and stumbled into the corridor. The air was heavy with static, the green glow of the warp lamps flaring brighter than usual, sparking along the metal piping. The sound grew louder with every step, a rhythmic chant, rough and brutal, punctuated by the crash of iron against iron. Somewhere below, something massive bellowed, and the tunnels shook as if struck by a hammer. By the time he reached the lower pits, chaos had already taken root. The cages that had once contained the Greenskins were shuddering under the strain of fists and bodies slamming against their bars. The orcs were roaring in unison, their voices merging into a single, terrifying rhythm. Even the smaller goblins, usually cowed and whimpering, had joined in, their shrill cries harmonizing into a frenzy of sound that made the air hum with energy. The Skaven guards were panicking. Some jabbed their spears through the bars, others fired Warpstone charges into the crowd, but it was useless. Every blast only seemed to make the greenskins angrier, their eyes glowing faintly with emerald fire. Skritch pushed through the mob of lesser engineers and slaves, forcing his way to the railing above the pens. He could feel the air vibrating through his bones. The shard beneath his clothes was burning like a coal, its light seeping through the fabric. It pulsed in time with the chanting, faster and faster. W-A-A-G. W. The roar shook the tunnel. He looked down into the central cage and saw Grubnash the Unkillable standing tall among his kin. The chains that bound him were snapping one by one, the metal glowing red, hot as if melting from the inside. His warped flesh shimmered with light, veins of Wyrdstone pulsing beneath the surface like molten rivers. When he threw back his head and roared, the sound wasn't just noise, it was power, raw and psychic, rolling through the tunnels like a storm surge. Skritch staggered. The shard on his chest answered, flaring bright enough to cast his shadow across the far wall. He felt something seize his mind, a pressure behind his eyes that wasn't his own. The connection to Grubnash had opened again, but this time it wasn't a whisper. It was a flood. Images crashed through his thoughts. Green fire, blades, screaming faces, the joy of slaughter. He felt the greenskins' exultation, the collective fury of hundreds of orcs and goblins merging into one roaring will. The shard was amplifying it, dragging that psychic energy through him like lightning through a wire, spreading it along the warp conduits of the tunnels. And the Skaven felt it too. From every passage, the lesser engineers and laborers were snarling, their fur bristling, their claws flexing as the Waaagh energy infected their nervous systems. They hissed and fought each other, eyes rolling white, as the psychic storm spread. Machines overloaded, pipes burst, and the smell of burning warp gas filled the air. Skritch could barely think. The shard's voice had become a roar, the rhythm of the Waaagh, thundering in his skull. He clutched at the railing, teeth bared, trying to fight the pulse. Around him the guards were screaming. The orcs had broken free, the pens torn apart by sheer brute strength. The floor trembled with the pounding of feet. He saw Grubnash rise above the others, a mountain of muscle and fury, smashing through the last of his chains. The air around him shimmered green, charged with energy, so thick it distorted the light. The orcs' gaze found him through the chaos, and for a moment their minds locked again. "You 999 this," the thought thundered through Skritch's head, half accusation, half laughter. "You lit the fire." Skritch couldn't breathe. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, the shard burning hotter and hotter. The connection between them was feeding on everything, the rage, the screams, the deaths. The energy coiled tighter, threatening to burst. Then the orcs surged upward, smashing through the guardrails. The Skaven ranks broke instantly. Panic erupted. Engineers fled, shrieking, while the greenskins tore through them with iron claws and scavenged blades. Warp lightning arced across the pits, illuminating scenes of butchery. Rats impaled on jagged spears, goblins trampled underfoot, the air alive with fire and blood. Skritch ran. He pushed through the corridors, stumbling over bodies, the shard's light flashing erratically. He had to stop it, had to contain it before the higher warlocks learned what had happened. The thought of discovery, of being dragged before the council for this disaster, clawed at him more than fear of death. When he reached the upper tunnels, 2 overseers blocked his path, sleek, armored, their warp halberds crackling. "Quickfang," one barked, voice muffled behind his mask. "What have you done? The pits are rioting. You 100 answer for this." Skritch didn't think. The shard moved before he 999. A burst of green energy exploded from his chest, a wave of heat and sound that threw both overseers against the wall. The air shimmered, and where their bodies struck the stone they burst apart, flesh and armor liquefying into steaming gore. The walls dripped red. He fell to his knees, gasping. The shard pulsed slower now, sated. He felt its satisfaction like a warm breath in his mind. Down below, the riot had become a slaughter. The Waaagh had taken hold completely, orcs tearing through Skaven lines, goblins dancing through blood and fire. Yet as he knelt there amid the bodies, Skritch realized he was not afraid. His heart was steady. The shard's glow had spread through him, and for the first time he felt the same exultation that had filled Grubnash. It was intoxicating, the feeling of command, of shared fury, of life at its most violent and pure. He could feel the orc's laughter echoing in his skull, and beneath it the pulse of something older and deeper. Prince. Watch. From the far end of the tunnel, a shape emerged through the haze, tall, robed, the white of bone gleaming beneath the hood. A gray seer. His horns curled like knives, his eyes twin pinpricks of warp light. He stood amid the wreckage, surveying the carnage with calm amusement. The air shimmered around him with raw power. He looked down at Skritch, not with anger, but with something worse. Interest. "So," the seer murmured, voice smooth as silk, but heavy as stone. The Underhive stirs, and the green gods whisper. His mouth twisted into a thin smile. Perhaps the horned one listens, too. The seer turned and vanished into the smoke, leaving Skritch kneeling among the corpses, the shard still glowing against his heart. Somewhere deep below, the Waaagh roared again, louder than before, and this time Skritch could not tell if it came from the Greenskins or from within himself. Chapter 5. Warlock Ascendant. The lower forges had burned for 3 days and nights after the riot. Even now, weeks later, the air still reeked of charred fur and greenish smoke. The walls were blackened with soot, the stone cracked where warp lightning had gouged through it. What had once been the heart of the Skaven labor engine was now a twisted ruin of melted metal and smoldering machines. But Skritch Quickfang lived. He emerged from the wreckage, thin, scarred, and changed. The shard had not left him. It never would now. It had fused into the flesh above his heart, its veins of green crystal spidering faintly beneath the skin. He could hide it beneath robes and armor, but never escape it. Its hum was constant, like the purr of a furnace, a steady rhythm that matched the beat of his own heart. The aftermath of the uprising had killed half the engineers in his division. His rivals were gone, their bodies buried under collapsed stone or reduced to ash by war fires they couldn't control. When the dust settled, there were few left who could claim command, and fewer still who dared question the survivor, who walked out of the chaos untouched. And so Skritch was raised, not to glory, but to responsibility. The title of Sub-Warlock of Warp Engineering was announced with little ceremony, his appointment sealed by the same gray seer who had watched the fires burn and smiled. The others whispered, of course. They called it opportunism, luck, or the Horn One's cruel sense of humor, but Skritch knew better. He had earned it, through blood, through cunning, and through the shard's silent guidance. The promotion came with access. Now, the deepest laboratories were his to command. Great domed caverns lit by warp flame, where machines hummed in endless cycles of heat and noise. Here, Skaven and their enslaved mutants labored over engines of war and arcane science, weapons to channel lightning, engines to rend stone, and constructs stitched from the flesh of the unwilling. The noise was constant, the clang of hammers, the hiss of steam, the low, almost organic moan of the warp reactors. Skritch took to the work with single-minded purpose. Officially, He was tasked with finding new ways to control the remaining Greenskin slaves, to harness their muscle and ferocity without allowing another uprising. The council demanded results, and fear of another riot made them impatient. He promised them a solution, one rooted in science and faith alike: warp-powered control collars. The devices were elegant in their brutality, iron rings set with slivers of warpstone, each one engraved with sigils drawn from both Skaven script and the crude glyphs of the Greenskin tongue. The collars pulsed faintly with green light, their surface alive with crawling static. When activated, they emitted a field of energy that burned into the subject's nervous system, severing the connection between mind and will. It was not simple pain, it was obedience, forced into the soul, or so the council believed. In truth, the collars 999 not suppressed the Waaagh energy, they channeled it. The shard had shown him how. Through the strange connection he shared with Grubnash, Skritch had come to understand that the Greenskin's power was not magic, not truly. It was instinct made manifest, a collective will that thrived on belief. The more they fought, the stronger they became, and their energy bled into the world around them like a poison. What if that energy could be harvested? What if it could be shaped? That was the true purpose of his design. The collars were conduits, meant not to restrain, but to focus. They would draw the Waaagh into a single circuit, a loop of power that could be stored, magnified, and unleashed. A living engine, powered by rage and belief, guided by the shard that pulsed in his chest. He began small, a handful of test subjects, drawn from the surviving Orc slaves. The process was brutal. Many died as the warpstone burned through their flesh, their skulls splitting under the strain. But a few survived, their eyes glowing faintly, their muscles twitching in unnatural rhythm. When they roared, the walls trembled, the air rippling with unseen pressure. Success. The seer visited him soon after. He came without warning, gliding through the laboratory's smoke and steam like a phantom. The other engineers scattered at his approach, their claws scraping in panicked haste. He was tall, his robes the color of dried blood, his horns wreathed in faint light. His eyes were pale and sharp, reflecting the warp flames like mirrors. Skritch bowed, his mask concealing the unease twisting his gut. The seer needed no introduction. His presence was power itself, a weight that filled the air. "So," the seer said, his tone smooth, almost conversational, "our sub-warlock rises quickly. The reports from the forges speak of progress." Skritch straightened. "Yes, the collars function as intended. The greenskins obey." "Obedience," the seer mused, pacing slowly among the humming machines. "A useful illusion. But tell me, little engineer, what is it you truly seek to make?" The question froze him. For a moment he thought the seer somehow knew that the deception had already been uncovered. But when he looked up, he found the seer smiling faintly, eyes gleaming with amusement. "One have seen what you build," the seer continued, "and one have felt it. The Underhive stirs with strange currents. The air hums with violence. You have tapped something dangerous." He stopped beside the containment pen where one of the collared Orcs was held. The creature stood silent, chest heaving, eyes flickering with green light. The seer regarded it for a long moment before turning back to Skritch. "You have talent, ambition. Those are not sins, not here." He leaned closer, the scent of warp ozone heavy around him. "Continue your work. Feed this energy. If it grows as one suspect, the council will reward you well, perhaps even with a seat among them. In time." The words hit like a hammer blow. A seat on the council, immortality in all but name. It was the highest promise any Skaven could dream of, and the most dangerous. Skritch bowed deeply. Your will guides me." Cecir's smile widened, sharp as a knife. "Oh, one doubt that. But one I am eager to see where your will leads." Then he was gone, fading into the haze as silently as he had come. Skritch stood alone in the workshop, the sound of machines and distant screaming filling the void. He turned back to the orc in the cage. The creature stared at him, its gaze dull and yet somehow aware. The collar around its neck pulsed, faintly, in rhythm with the shard beneath his robes. He placed his clawed hand against the glass and felt the vibration pass between them. "Yes," he whispered to the dark. "We 100. See how far it leads." As he turned away, the shard warmed against his heart, and in the back of his mind he heard a familiar growl. Grubnash's laughter, faint and mocking. The Waaghs was stirring again, deeper this time. And Skritch, whether he knew it or not, was no longer its master. Chapter 6. The Flooded Warrens. The air in the lower burrows was heavy with the scent of wet rot and chemical smoke, the kind of air that clung to fur and metal alike. Every breath burned faintly with ammonia and decay. The water levels had been rising for weeks, pooling in the lower tunnels where the forges once glowed, and the slave pits echoed with the sound of orcish roars. The riot's aftermath had turned those places into graveyards, half collapsed in stagnant filth. Skritch Quickfang had made his laboratory in the ruins above that mire. The walls dripped constantly, condensation falling in slow, rhythmic beats from the pipes overhead. His work tables were a chaos of warped iron and flickering instruments, the air alive with the hum of warp power. Around him, the surviving greenskins labored in silence, their collars pulsing in 1499 synchrony. They moved like sleepwalkers, eyes glazed but burning faintly with green light. He had perfected the control collars since his promotion, refining the sigils, calibrating the feedback conduits. Each new design drew the wallet energy out of the greenskins with greater precision, feeding it into reservoirs of charged warpstone. The power that gathered there was unlike anything he had felt before, raw, living, and defiant. It burned hotter than any reactor flame, but power in the Under-Empire never remained secret for long. It began with whispers, quiet at first, traded between traders and scavengers who had seen his experiments or smelled the ozone discharge from his tunnels. Then came the agents of the other clans. Clan molders sent their beasts first, rat ogres bred for hunting and capture, hulking things of bone and muscle whose eyes glowed faintly with injected warp fluids. They came under the pretense of cooperation, their handlers speaking of shared research, of genetic opportunity. They wanted his greenskins. They wanted to cut them apart, fuse their meat to new creations, turn his captives into mindless war beasts. Clan pestilence followed. Their emissaries arrived wrapped in rotting robes, reeking of disease. They brought gifts, urns of holy filth, censers that exhaled clouds of black vapor. They bowed low, their voices rasping with piety, speaking of divine contagion and shared worship. What they truly wanted was simple, to test their new plagues on his slaves, to see how the greenskin constitution would endure corruption. Skritch entertained them both for a time. He had no choice. To refuse outright would have been suicide. So he smiled, he nodded, he lied. He let them see what he wished them to see, the obedient slaves, the docile creatures. He even demonstrated the collars, showing how they hummed with perfect subservience. But he could smell the greed on them, could hear the muttered plans behind his back. The molders thought him weak. The pestilence priests thought him damned. And both, he realized, were right in their own way. The shard on his chest burned hotter with each passing day. The voice that lived inside it had grown bolder, more insistent. It no longer whispered, it spoke, low and resonant, filling his dreams and seeping into his waking thoughts. Sometimes it was two voices, overlapping, one sharp and chittering, the other deep and booming like the roll of thunder. The thunder, "Take what is yours," it said. "They will steal it. They always steal. Crush them, drown them, feed them to the dark." He stopped sleeping. He barely ate. His eyes gleamed with the same warped light that shone in the collars. The energy in the air thickened around him, vibrating through the metal floor like the purr of a living machine. When the first Molder patrol entered his lower chambers, he didn't even pretend diplomacy. They came armed, half a dozen handlers, 3 rat ogres, and a pack of smaller mutants on chains. Their leader was a massive figure wrapped in a cloak of stitched hides, his snout covered by a mask of polished bone. His voice rasped through the filter. "You hoard the Greenskins," he said, surveying the chained orcs with a calculating eye. "Unwise. Their flesh would make strong stock. We will take them now. Compensation will be arranged." Behind him, one of the rat ogres growled, a low, wet sound, its spine bristling with needles of metal and bone. Skritch stood at the far end of the chamber, lit from behind by the pulsing glow of his Warpstone conduits. The shard burned beneath his robes, casting an emerald sheen across the wet floor. He 999 not move. "The Orcs," he said softly, "are not beasts. They are engines." The Molder handler tilted his head. "Engines?" "Yes." Skritch smiled faintly. "Engines that run on rage." He reached for the control console beside him. The shard pulsed once, and the air around him crackled. The collars on the greenskins flared to life. The orcs convulsed, roaring as the warpstone embedded in their necks ignited with furious light. Their veins glowed, their muscles bulged, and the air itself began to vibrate with psychic resonance. The Waaagh energy, once suppressed, was released in a sudden surge. The rat ogres howled. The Molder handlers screamed. The explosion wasn't fire, it was pressure. A wave of energy that burst outward, crushing the first rank of intruders against the walls. The stone cracked. The lights shattered. One of the ogres was hurled backward, its limbs twisting grotesquely as its internal organs ruptured. The others turned to flee, but the tunnels were already collapsing. Water burst through the floor vents, thick and foul, reeking of decay. The old waste channels beneath the lab, sealed for years, had given way under the pressure. The deluge came in a roaring torrent, sweeping through the passages like a living tide. The green glow of warp flame flickered beneath the surface, turning the flood into a shining river of poison. Skritch barely moved. The shard guided him, its pulse steady, its voice calm amid the chaos. "Let it wash them away," it murmured. "Let the filth feed the chosen." The Molders were gone in seconds, their screams drowned under the rush of water. The flood spread outward, surging into neighboring tunnels, into the quarters of the pestilence emissaries, into the forges, into the slave pens. Everything it touched dissolved. Bodies, machines, walls, all carried away in the torrent of corruption. Skritch stood on the highest platform, the flood licking at his boots, and watched as his enemies vanished. The shard's glow filled the chamber, reflecting in the churning waters below. The roar of the deluge echoed through the warrens, mingling with the distant thunder of collapsing stone. Then, slowly, the water began to still. The surface shimmered with oily color hues of green and red swirling together. Shapes floated beneath, indistinct at first, then clearer. Faces twisted in terror, bodies locked in the final throes of death. The shard drank their essence, light coursing up through the waves like fire through glass. Skritch felt it inside him. Each death fed the shard, and through it, him. His thoughts burned with clarity. His veins thrummed with energy. He could feel the presence of Grubnash again, faint and mocking at the edge of his mind, but there was something else now, something vast and layered beneath it. Two voices, one separate, now overlapping. "Chosen," they whispered in unison. "Chosen of the Horned One, chosen of the Green Gods." The bridge between worlds of hate. He fell to his knees as the power coursed through him, laughter spilling unbidden from his lips. It echoed through the flooded chambers, rising above the hiss of the dying machines. The water below glowed brighter, pulsing in time with the shard. When the light finally dimmed, Skritch stood alone amid the ruin. The floodwaters settled into the broken tunnels, stagnant and still, the corpses of his enemies drifting in the dark. He turned away from the railing, his reflection flickering in the toxic water, a figure neither Skaven nor anything else that should have walked the mortal world. His eyes burned green. The veins beneath his skin traced the same luminous lines as the shard, and when he spoke, the words were not his own. "The filth washes clean." The laughter that followed was not one voice, but three. Chapter 7. Rise of the Vermin Waaagh. The floodwaters eventually receded, but the warrens never recovered. What had once been the domain of metal and science became a labyrinth of dripping tunnels and half-drowned chambers where the walls wept and the floors pulsed faintly with unseen energy. The warpstone that once powered the forges now ran like veins through the rock, glowing softly in the dark. The air was thick, damp, and alive with a faint hum, as though the tunnels themselves were breathing. Skritch Quickfang's laboratory stood above it all, perched on the edge of what had once been the main production shaft. Below, the water glowed faintly green, casting shifting reflections on the curved walls. The light painted Skritch's gaunt face in eerie colors as he worked, his claws blackened with oil and blood. The shard in his chest pulsed faintly with each breath, its glow visible beneath his robes. It no longer needed to speak to him. Its presence was constant now, a second consciousness coiled just behind his own, whispering without words, shaping his thoughts and movements. The greenskins that remained were no longer slaves in the simple sense. The collars had changed, the flood had corrupted the metal, the warp energy had warped the runes, and the shard's influence had twisted everything further. The collars no longer obeyed commands from the consoles. Instead, they pulsed of their own accord, flashing with erratic bursts of green light. The orcs and goblins that wore them no longer stood in mindless obedience. They stared, their eyes flickering between vacant and aware, as if caught between two worlds. At first, Skritch tried to fix them. He replaced the sigils, recalibrated the feedback coils, but nothing responded. The collars seemed to reject his interference, adapting, reshaping themselves. Some fused entirely into the flesh of their wearers. Others began to hum in rhythm with the shard, their glow beating like a heartbeat. The greenskins, once docile, began to stir. They started to murmur. At first it was incoherent, grunts and growls, fragments of speech too warped to recognize. Then, as days passed, the sounds grew louder, more organized, more rhythmic. It was not the Waaagh chant of old, not quite. It was something new, rougher, broken. But the syllables were unmistakable. The sound echoed through the lower tunnels, a distorted chorus that set Skritch's fur on end. He stood at the railing of his laboratory and listened as the chant grew, spreading from chamber to chamber. The greenskins banged their fists on the walls, their voices merging into a single thunderous rhythm. The shard flared. Energy rolled through the tunnels like a physical wave. Machines sparked, lights burst. The very air seemed to vibrate with a soundless pressure. Skritch staggered, gripping the railing, his vision swimming. The shard's glow spread through his veins, tracing lines of green fire beneath his skin. He could feel them, every greenskin, every heartbeat, every pulse of rage. Their minds were not separate anymore. They were connected, bound by the collars, by the shard, by him. But the power wasn't stable. The energy built with every chant, every scream feeding back into the collars. Sparks leapt from metal to flesh. Orcs convulsed. Goblins clawed at their throats as the warpstone embedded in their necks flared white-hot. The smell of burning meat filled the tunnels, thick and acrid. Then the screaming began. The first to fall was a goblin, small, twitching, its eyes bulging as its skin split open. Green light poured from the wounds, searing the air. The creature's bones warped, its limbs snapping and reforming in grotesque shapes. Fur erupted from its shoulders and spine, coarse and matted. Its jaw elongated, teeth becoming jagged and rodent-like. It arose, screaming, its voice half chitter, half roar. Others followed. The orc's muscles bulged and split, veins glowing as the corruption consumed them. Their tusks lengthened into hooked fangs, their hands sprouting claws. Their skin darkened, fur spreading across it in uneven patches. Their faces twisted, half orc, half rat, snouts pushing through flesh as the collars fused completely into their bodies, becoming part of their bones. The transformation spread like infection. The air filled with the stench of blood and warp gas, with the sounds of tearing flesh and cracking bone. Those that didn't die screaming became something else. Creatures that walked upright but hunched low, their movements twitching and quick, their eyes burning with twin fires of hatred and hunger. When the light finally dimmed, the tunnels fell silent. Skritch stood at the center of his ruined laboratory, surrounded by smoke and the stench of death. The survivors, his new creations, stared at him through the haze. Dozens of them, furred and green-skinned, their bodies rippling with unnatural strength. Some still bore traces of their former selves, an orc's broad shoulders, a goblin's wiry limbs. But their features were Skaven now, their faces drawn into snarling muzzles, their claws glistening with fresh blood. They waited, motionless, as though awaiting command. Skritch could feel their minds pressing against his, not individuals, not separate thoughts, but a collective awareness, a unity of purpose. They were bound to him through the shard, through the same force that had bound him to Grubnash. Only now it was inverted. He was the center. He was the pulse. The shard beat, and they moved in rhythm with it. He took a step forward. Their heads turned in unison. The shard whispered, not in words this time, but in sensation. Hunger, triumph, divinity. The echo of the green god's laughter mingled with the hiss of something older, sharper. The horned rat. The voices overlapped, indistinguishable now, merging into one. Chosen. Leader. Bridge. Lord of rage and ruin. A strange calm came over him. The fear was gone. The doubts, the panic, the sense of inferiority that had haunted his every step through Skaven society all burned away in the light of this revelation. He was no longer a scavenger in the dark, no longer a survivor clawing for scraps of power. He was the architect of something new. He looked down at his creations, the first of their kind. The air trembled as they shifted restlessly, claws scraping against the wet stone. Their breathing was synchronized, heavy and animal. The sound of it filled the tunnels, echoing like a heartbeat. The shard pulsed once more, brighter than ever before. "Rise," Skritch whispered. The creatures stirred. One roared, a sound so deep and resonant it shook the ceiling dust loose. Others joined in, the noise swelling into a deafening chorus of growls and screeches. The walls vibrated. Cracks split through the rock. He watched as they tore through the remnants of the lower forges, smashing through debris and collapsed tunnels. They moved with terrifying speed, overwhelming everything in their path. Where they passed, nothing living remained. They were not Skaven. They were not Greenskin. They were something new, something impossible. A union of cunning and fury, of technology and primal chaos. The Shard's corruption had made them perfect instruments of destruction. Their eyes glowed with the same green light that pulsed in Skritch's chest. In the chaos that followed, the surviving Skaven clans fled or died. Those who witnessed the birth of the Horde spoke later in broken whispers of the Orcs, creatures that screamed in 2 tongues and fought with the strength of 10 rats, their laughter echoing through the tunnels like thunder. And at their head, calm amid the storm, stood Skritch Quickfang. Once a scavenger, now a god among monsters. He felt the shard throb in his chest and raised his clawed hand. The Horde fell silent, awaiting command. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice, Grubnash's voice, still lingered, deep and sardonic. "You've done it, little rat." And beneath that, 2 greater voices laughed together, one the echoing shriek of the horned rat, the other the booming mirth of Gork, or possibly Mork. The laughter merged, shaking the earth, and Skritch smiled, baring teeth that were no longer entirely his own. Chapter 8. The Betrayal. The Underhive was quiet again, too quiet. The screaming had stopped, the echoes of war receding into the endless labyrinth of tunnels that made up Skritch Quickfang's domain. The Orcs, his monstrous offspring, slept in the lower chambers, their massive bodies curled together in the dark. Their breathing filled the halls like the rumble of distant thunder, rhythmic and primal. Skritch stood in his sanctum, the glow of warp flame casting green shadows across the walls. His reflection wavered in the polished metal of the machinery surrounding him, a warped, spectral image of a creature caught between 2 worlds. The shard in his chest no longer pulsed with an external rhythm. It had become part of him now, fused to his heart. Its veins traced beneath his skin like roots of living crystal. His eyes burned faintly with the same unnatural light. In the wake of his rise, the Council of 13 had been silent. No summons, no messages, only whispers. That silence was not mercy. It was the silence of predators waiting to strike. He felt it long before the attack came. The shard had made him sensitive to power, to the ripples in the warp, to the tremors in the tunnels. Something was moving against him. The air grew heavy, the lights flickered, and the rats that scurried through the pipes began to disappear, as though something unseen was devouring them. Then came the sound, the faint, rhythmic scrape of metal on stone, echoing from somewhere deep in the corridor outside, too regular to be random, too careful to be ordinary. Skritch turned from his work table, his claws resting on the console that controlled the sanctum's defenses. The shadows seemed to shift at the edges of the green light. The attack was sudden. A shape burst from the dark, lean, fast, a blur of motion and silver. The first blade missed his throat by inches, catching the edge of his robe instead. The second came from behind, slashing across his shoulder. He spun, snarling, as a trio of figures emerged from the gloom. They were cloaked in black, their armor dull and pitted, their eyes hidden behind visors of burnished metal. Each carried a warpstone blade that shimmered with sickly energy. Their movements were silent, perfectly coordinated. Skaven Eshin assassins, trained for killing in absolute darkness. The Council had sent them. He had expected spies, perhaps sabotage, but not this. The Council never acted so directly unless commanded. That meant only one thing: the Grey Seer had betrayed him. He barely had time to think. The assassins moved as one, fanning out to surround him. Their blades flashed in the gloom, their tails lashing for balance. Skritch ducked under one strike, the shard flaring in warning. The next came low, slicing across his ribs, leaving a trail of green fire in its wake. He hissed in pain and slammed his hand against the nearest machine. The sanctum screamed to life. Pipes ruptured, valves burst open, warp flame erupted from the vents in a storm of emerald light. The assassins recoiled, leaping back as the floor ignited. The smell of burning metal and ozone filled the air. One assassin wasn't fast enough. His cloak caught fire, the warp flames spreading like oil. He fell, shrieking, his body twisting as the energy consumed him. Skritch seized the moment. He reached into the circuitry, pulling at the warp energy that powered the laboratory. The shard responded instantly, its veins flaring. The lights dimmed, then pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. The air grew electric, the walls vibrating with the force of raw magic. The surviving assassin struck again, moving through the smoke like shadows. One came from above, dropping from the rafters, blades first. Skritch raised his hand and the shard flared again. A burst of energy erupted from his palm, catching the assassin mid-air. The creature exploded into fragments, limbs scattering like burnt paper. The last two pressed forward, silent and relentless. One darted low, feinting toward his legs, while the other went high, aiming for his throat. They moved with terrifying precision, killers who had ended dozens of their own kind without hesitation. But Skritch was no longer one of them. The shard's power coursed through his veins, spreading into his muscles. His body reacted faster than thought, faster than instinct. He caught one assassin's wrist 1499 swing, twisting until the bone snapped with a wet crack. The other blade sank into his side, but instead of blood, a burst of green light erupted from the wound, hurling the attacker backward. He turned on the last assassin. The creature hesitated, just for a heartbeat, and that was enough. Skritch lunged forward, his claws closing around the assassin's throat. The shard pulsed once, and energy surged through him, down his arm, into his enemy. The assassin's body convulsed, his eyes bulging, before his flesh liquefied under the heat of the warp. When it was done, Skritch stood in the center of the carnage, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The sanctum was a ruin, flames licking the walls, the floor littered with smoking remains. The shard in his chest glowed like a star, its light seeping through his skin. He staggered, clutching at his ribs. The wound there still burned, but the pain was changing. It spread outward, searing through his body like molten metal. His vision swam. He fell to his knees, gasping, as the shard began to hum. The sound filled the chamber, low, resonant, endless. Then came the transformation. It began in his hands, the claws thickening, darkening, the skin beneath turning coarse and green. His arms bulged, veins rising under the surface like cables, his spine arched, bones cracking, muscles twisting in unnatural patterns, his face contorted, the bones shifting, the muzzle elongating slightly, his teeth sharpening into jagged fangs. He screamed, but the sound that tore from his throat was not entirely his own. It was deeper, harsher, a guttural roar that shook dust from the ceiling. The shard sank deeper into his chest, fusing completely with his flesh. Its light vanished beneath the skin, but its pulse remained, visible only as a faint shimmer that moved beneath the surface like a living heart. When the convulsions stopped, he was changed. He rose slowly, unsteady at first, then with growing confidence. His reflection stared back at him in the shattered metal, something neither Skaven nor Orc, but both. His body was taller, heavier, his limbs thick with muscle, his fur streaked with green veins, his eyes burned with a cold, steady fire, and when he spoke, his voice carried an echo that was not his own. The shard had not only fused with him, it had completed him. The laughter came then, faint at first, then rising to fill the chamber, not from outside, but from within. Two voices, speaking as one chittering and cruel, the other booming and brutal. You are the bridge. You are the fury. You are ours. He looked down at the corpses around him, at the blood and smoke, at the green fire still licking the walls. The Grey Seer had thought to destroy him, to erase a heretic before the council could be tainted by his creations, but the Seer had only accelerated what was inevitable. The shard's fume deepened, resonating through his bones. Skritch lifted his head toward the darkness above. His voice was low, steady, and filled with power. Then let them come. Outside, in the flooded warrens, the Squeak-Orcs stirred as if roused by an unheard signal. Their eyes snapped open, glowing bright green. The Vermin Waaagh breathed again. Chapter 9. Waaagh Below. The Underhive had always been a place of noise, of skittering clanging, and the endless hum of machinery. But now that noise had changed. It was no longer mechanical. It was primal. A deep, rolling sound that shook dust from the ceilings and rippled through the black veins of the tunnels like thunder. It began as a faint vibration, barely perceptible even to Skritch's sharpened senses, a tremor that felt like a heartbeat echoing through the rock. But as hours passed, it grew louder, steadier, and unmistakable. It was chanting, low at first, then swelling into a single word that reverberated through the walls, through the very air. Waaagh. The roar rolled through the depths of the Undercity like a living thing, carrying with it the weight of 1,000 savage throats. Skritch stood in the ruined observatory chamber of his citadel, his claws gripping the cold metal railing as the sound washed over him. His reflection in the cracked viewing glass was something monstrous now, half rat, half orc, his fur threaded with veins of sickly green light that pulsed with the shard's rhythm. His eyes burned twin points of emerald fire. Beneath the floor, his Squeak-Orc creations stirred restlessly, snarling and chittering in unison. But even they flinched at that roar. It carried a power older and deeper than Warpstone, something untamed, something that had crawled up from the dawn of the world and never truly died. He knew that voice. Grubnash da Unkillable was a lie. The thought hit him like a blade to the chest. It was impossible. Grubnash had been consumed, his body broken and devoured by the shard's energy during the uprising. But the voice that bellowed from the deep tunnels below carried the same timbre, the same raw, booming cadence. It was a voice that demanded to be heard, to be followed. Skritch closed his eyes and reached inward toward the shard. For weeks it had been silent, feeding and pulsing, but speaking only in half-whispers. Now it flared with violent intensity. The air around him shimmered. He saw flashes, green light, roaring mobs, crude glyphs smeared in blood across the walls. And at the heart of it all he saw Grubnash, massive, scarred, glowing with a halo of shimmering energy that made the very air boil. But the connection was wrong. Once Skritch had been the conduit, the center through which the shard's power flowed. Now that power surged away from him. Grubnash had become a beacon, a living magnet for the Waaagh, energy that churned through the depths. The link that had once bound Orc to Skaven had inverted. Grubnash was no longer his subject. He was ascendant, and the Waaagh was coming for him. He turned from the window as the first tremors rocked the citadel. The walls shuddered, dust and shards of metal raining from above. Somewhere deep below, alarms began to blare, their shrill cries swallowed by the growing roar from the tunnels. The Underhive itself was convulsing, the great arteries of the Skaven domain filling with movement, with war. He strode to the central platform, the shard in his chest burning hotter with every heartbeat. The Squeak-Orcs gathered around him, dozens of them, their green-furred bodies heaving, their yellowed eyes flicking toward the dark tunnels that led outward into the lower levels. They felt it too, the pull, the hunger, the ancient call that clawed at their minds. Through the cracks and fissures in the floor came the distant echoes of war, metal slamming against stone, guttural war cries, and the shriek of dying Skaven. The Waaagh had reached the lower warrens. Skritch descended the metal stairs into the command vault. Maps and runic charts covered the walls, drawn in warped chalk and lit by the flicker of dying warp lamps. The channels of the Underhive stretched for miles, a labyrinth of collapsed tunnels, old forges, and flooded burrows. But the vibrations of the approaching horde were clear. They were spreading through every available path, breaking through collapsed walls, using the old sewer veins like arteries of war. He could feel them now, thousands of greenskins surging upward in a tide of fury. Their rage wasn't blind. It was focused. Each one carried a sliver of the shard's energy within them, a faint echo of his own corruption. The connection that once tied them to him now bound them to Grubnash, forming a psychic net that burned through the dark. And at the center of that net, the voice of their leader roared, clearer and stronger with every passing moment. Skritch, the sound of his own name, distorted and thunderous, filled the tunnels. He froze. It wasn't a chant of loyalty. It was a hunt. The Waaagh wasn't following him. It was seeking him. The realization hit like a physical blow. The shard pulsed violently, the veins beneath his skin flaring so bright they glowed through his fur. He staggered, gripping the edge of the table as visions poured into his mind. Grubnash standing on a mountain of corpses, his massive hand clutching a crude banner made from stitched Skaven hides. Around him, thousands of orcs, goblins, and hybrids roared in unison, their eyes burning with a single shared desire. They wanted him. They wanted the shard. They wanted the power that had once been his. The roar of the Waaagh shook the citadel to its foundations. "Prepare the defenses," he snarled. His voice cracked the air, reverberating through the chamber like a whip. The squeak orcs below snapped into motion, clambering up the walls, hefting scavenged weapons, setting makeshift barricades. The tunnels filled with the hiss and scrape of metal as they armed themselves. But even as he shouted, he knew it was hopeless. The first wave hit like an avalanche. The lower gates exploded inward, molten metal spraying in all directions. A tide of green bodies surged through the breach. Orcs, goblins, and stranger things born of the shard's corruption. Their weapons were crude but deadly, their armor nothing more than scrap metal fused to flesh. The air filled with a stench of fungus and blood. The squeak orcs met them head-on. The clash was apocalyptic. Claws tore into muscle, teeth into bone. Warp flame belched from the vents, setting entire corridors ablaze. The screams of dying creatures echoed through the complex, mingling with the roar of the invading horde. Skritch moved through it all like a ghost of war. The shard's light carved through the smoke, each step leaving scorched footprints in the metal. He tore through attackers with claw and flame, the shard's energy spilling from his hands in molten arcs. Every kill fed it, made it hungrier. But for each enemy that fell, 2 more came in their place. Through the chaos a voice boomed again, closer now, deeper. "You took it from me, rat. Now it's mine." The tunnels shook, the lights burst. From the darkness ahead came Grubnash the Unkillable. He was colossal now, larger than any orc had a right to be. His flesh shot through with veins of warpstone that pulsed like molten glass. His left arm had fused entirely with a chunk of machinery, the metal glowing faintly with runes that Skritch recognized, his own. The collars, the technology, the shard's energy, Grubnash had absorbed it all. His eyes glowed with green fire, and every step he took left the walls cracking behind him. "Trubnash," Skritch said quietly, though his voice carried through the din. The oak grinned, revealing jagged teeth. "Still alive. Good. One need you alive." The shard in Skritch's chest burned white-hot. The connection between them reignited, no longer a thread but a chain pulled taut. He could feel Grubnash's thoughts, his fury, his hunger, his purpose. The orc wasn't simply marching for revenge. He was drawn to the shard itself, compelled to reclaim it, to merge with it completely. Around them, the Waaagh raged. The citadel's walls cracked, machinery screamed. The Squeak-Orcs fought to the last, their bodies falling in heaps as the green tides swallowed them whole. Skritch took a step forward. The shard pulsed once more, a deep, resonant note that shook the ground. For an instant, both he and Grubnash froze, two living conduits of the same impossible power, caught in a gravitational pull neither could resist. The Waaagh howled, the Underhive trembled, and deep within the heart of the Warpstone shard, something vast and ancient stirred, something that had once been two gods, and was now becoming one. Skritch understood then. The Waaagh no longer followed Grubnash or him. It followed the shard itself. And the shard hungered, not for conquest, but for unity, for completion. It wanted to devour them both. The roar of battle became indistinguishable from the roar of the earth itself as the tunnels began to collapse, the walls splitting open under the weight of divine fury. And through it all, above the chaos and death, the Waaagh chanted on, no longer calling his name in hate or worship, but in inevitability. Skritch, skritch, skritch. Each echo carried the same terrible truth. The war below was no longer a rebellion. It was evolution. Chapter 10. The Great Betrayal. Again. The war beneath the world had become a cacophony, a constant thunder of collapsing tunnels, shrieking beasts, and the bellow of greenskins driven mad by the shard's call. Skritch Quickfang had watched the Underhive fracture like a rotten tooth. The Skaven clans fought among themselves, even as Grubnash's Waaagh surged upward, sweeping through warrens and foundries alike. The air was thick with the reek of death and molten metal. It was a losing war. For all his strength and cunning, Skritch could feel the tide turning against him. His Squeak-Orcs, once his army, his children, were being devoured by the growing horde of greenskins that crawled through the cracks of the tunnels. The balance had shifted. The shard's voice, once a steady whisper in his mind, was now a storm of overlapping thoughts, Gork and Mork laughing, the horn rat screeching, and, something deeper, wordless roaring with hunger. Skritch understood the truth. To survive, he would have to ally with monsters more dangerous than the ones at his gates. And so he descended. The tunnels of Clan Moulder lay below even the flooded warrens, deep caverns where the air was warm and slick, thick with the stink of meat and chemicals. Pipes lined the walls like veins, carrying black fluids that hissed and bubbled as they leaked. The corridors pulsed faintly with life, as though the stone itself was alive, sweating and breathing. He passed through a hall lined with cages. In each, something moved, twitching, moaning, scraping claws along iron bars. Mutants of every description, wolf rats with eyeless faces, things stitched together from corpses, abominations whose limbs ended in claws that dripped with warp fluid. The air vibrated with their low animal growls. At the end of the corridor, beyond a curtain of chains, stood the Master of Moulder, a creature so warped it was difficult to tell where flesh ended and machinery began. A great, hump-backed figure, draped in ragged furs and bound with brass straps. Its many eyes gleamed red in the 1499 light. Tubes pumped fluids into its veins, and its hands, if they could be called that, were clusters of claws grafted from other beasts. "You come begging," the Master crooned, its voice a mixture of growl and gurgle. "You, who flooded the warrens, who killed our breeding stock, now crawl here for help. Skritch stepped into the green glow of the chamber. His armor was scorched and pitted, his robes torn, his body a patchwork of fur and green-tinged flesh. The shard in his chest glowed faintly through the fabric, pulsing like a dying heart. "Want come to offer you something better," he said. "Greenskin flesh, endless supply, strong stock, ripe for molding." The master's many eyes blinked in slow sequence. "And in return, your beasts," Skritch said. "Your laboratories, your war monsters. One will take them and use them to retake the Underhive. Together we can forge an army that even the Council would fear." The chamber fell silent except for the sound of dripping fluids. The master leaned forward, its joints creaking. "You want our creations to fight your war." A pause. "You want to bind our genius to your madness." Skritch met its gaze without flinching. "You will have slaves enough to fill your pens 1,000 times over. Greenskins, Skaven, flesh for centuries." For a long moment the only sound was the wet hiss of the pipes. Then the master's laugh filled the chamber, a low, gurgling sound like a burst bladder. The deal was struck in blood and filth, sealed by the shard's faint hum. Days later, the tunnels shook with the arrival of the new army. The molder beasts poured from the darkness like a tide of nightmares. Giant troll rats, stitched together with cables and rivets, lumbered through the flooded corridors, their eyes glowing faintly with warp fire. Squigs had been fused with rat carcasses to create something worse, squat, rolling orbs of teeth and fur, their bodies pulsing with unpredictable energy. Smaller creatures scurried between them, carrying volatile pods that dripped green liquid from their spines. The battle began in silence. Skritch stood at the center of the storm, his armor reinforced with plates of scavenged brass, his claws crackling with warp light. The shard's glow illuminated the tunnels ahead where Grobnash's horde was gathering, a wall of muscle, tusks, and fury, the echo of their chant pounding through the air. When the two forces met, the sound was like the earth tearing open. Light flared, illuminating a nightmare of flesh and violence. The troll rats smashed into the orc ranks, crushing bodies beneath their massive claws. Warp oils along their flanks burst like mines, spraying jets of corrosive fluid that melted armor and flesh alike. Squig rats rolled through the chaos, exploding on impact in clouds of toxic gas that left even the orcs cuffing and clawing at their eyes. Grobnash's Waaagh met them with equal savagery. The orcs came howling through the smoke, hacking apart beasts with crude cleavers, tearing cables from their bodies. Goblins leapt onto the troll rats' backs, stabbing wildly until they were shaken off or crushed. Skritch moved through the carnage like a phantom, the shard's energy radiating outward in waves. Every time he raised his claws, bolts of green lightning leapt from his hands, tearing through lines of orcs. Where the lightning struck, bodies twisted and burst into showers of sparks. But the cost was enormous. Clan Molder's creations were uncontrollable. Many turned on each other, their minds collapsing under the pressure of the warp. The battlefield became a seething mass of teeth and claws, a grotesque engine of destruction that devoured everything in reach. The tunnels themselves began to collapse from the force of the fighting. Through it all, Skritch could feel the shard feeding. Every death, every scream, every flash of violent energy poured into it. Its light had grown unbearably bright now, radiating through his chest until his entire body seemed to glow from within. The pulse of it drowned out the noise of the battle, thudding like a second heartbeat in his skull. He caught sight of Grobnash across the field, the orc war chief roaring orders, his massive frame wreathed in a nimbus of green flame. Their eyes met for a single heartbeat, and Skritch felt the connection flare between them again, stronger, sharper. Power surged through the link like fire through a wire. Grobnash staggered under the pressure, clutching at his chest, but then his laughter rolled across the battlefield. "You can't kill me, rat," he roared. "When I am the Waaagh-Rat." The shard responded with a shuddering pulse that threw Skritch to his knees. The world seemed to tilt. He heard the laughter of gods again, distant, overlapping, impossible to separate. When he rose, the battlefield was still. The Waaagh had broken. Grubnash was gone, swallowed by the rubble as the tunnels collapsed behind his retreating horde. The molder beasts lay in heaps of steaming flesh, their bodies already dissolving into sludge. The survivors, both Skaven and Orc, stumbled through the smoke, dazed, staring at the destruction their masters had wrought. Skritch stood alone amid the ruin. The shard's light was dimming, fading from green to an eerie gold. It was changing, its hum deeper now, its voice no longer a whisper, but a chorus. He pressed a clawed hand against his chest, feeling the shard's warmth beneath his skin. It no longer spoke in the language of the horned rat or the greenskin gods. It spoke in something older, more primal, a sound that vibrated through the marrow of his bones. Radak. The word echoed inside his skull, resonating through every fiber of his being. The name was not a title. It was a destiny. He turned toward the shattered tunnels where Grubnash had fled. The air still glowed faintly from the fires of war, the walls dripping with condensed warp fluid. The hum of the shard deepened as though it were listening to something only it could hear. Skritch smiled, a small, sharp thing that revealed the rows of fangs beneath his lips. The Waaagh was not over. It had only changed its shape. And now, for the first time, it had a true name. The Waaagh-Rat had been born. Chapter 11. The Council's Judgment. The summons came at dusk, carried on a strip of warp-treated parchment that hissed faintly as it burned itself into his table. Skritch had expected it. For days whispers had spread through the remaining clans, stories of his abominations, of his alliance with Clan Moulder, of the unnatural fusions that stalked the flooded tunnels. The Council of 13 could not ignore such heresy for long. Even the Grey Seers, who had encouraged him once, could not protect him forever. He read the summons once, then burned the ash into dust between his claws. The shard beneath his chest pulsed faintly, as though laughing. He dressed for war. Not in armor, he had no illusions that steel would save him, but in ceremony. His robes were dark, trimmed with copper thread that shimmered like blood in the light. The shard glowed faintly beneath the fabric, its veins tracing molten patterns along his ribs. When he looked into the mirror of black glass, he saw not a Skaven, not an Orc, but something caught between. His face was lean, sharp, his teeth glinting like blades, his eyes burned with green fire. He descended through the lower passages of the Under-Empire, the air growing colder with each step. The council chamber lay deep below the world, carved into the bones of the earth itself. Here, the walls were slick with condensation, and the air was heavy with warp energy. Every breath tasted of copper and ozone. When he entered, the chamber was already alive with light. 13 thrones of carved obsidian rose in a half-circle around the central pit. Each throne was occupied, cloaked figures, the most powerful minds of Skavendom, their horns gleaming faintly beneath the witchlight. Between them, warp flames flickered in tall braziers, casting long, writhing shadows across the cavern. But this time, it had the power of a compressed multitude. The Grey Seer who had once been his patron stood near the center, his robes immaculate, his face serene. But there was something predatory in the set of his jaw, a satisfaction barely concealed beneath his calm expression. "Skritch Quickfang," he said, his voice echoing through the hollow chamber. "You stand accused of heresy, of blasphemy, of consorting with beasts beyond Skaven kind. You have brought greenskin corruption into our sacred domains. You have tainted the warp itself." Murmurs rose from the thrones, overlapping whispers that hissed like serpents. Skritch stepped into the circle, his claws clicking softly against the stone. One brought power, he said. His voice was low, steady, carrying easily over the noise. Power that could have remade us. The shard's energy, the fusion of faith and fury, could elevate Skavendom beyond the surface filth we crawl under. A warlock engineer leaned forward, his metal jaw grinding as he spoke. You fused orc and rat. You bred filth with our blood. There is no elevation in mutation, only damnation. Another voice, a seer's, hissed from the far side. The Horned One despises impurity. You have courted ruin. Skritch smiled faintly. The Horned One despises weakness more. The murmurs turned to shouts. Sparks crackled in the air as warp energy flared from the braziers, responding to the tension. The council chambers seemed to close in, the air thick and stifling. The Grey Seer raised his staff, bringing silence. You have no place among us, he said. Your works are an abomination. Your shard will be taken. Your body will be unmade. Your name will be forgotten. It was then, as the seer's words echoed through the chamber, that Skritch felt it. The shard pulsing harder, faster. A vibration deep within his chest, like the beating of another heart. The voices that had haunted his dreams surged back, louder than ever before. They think themselves gods, they whispered. Show them the truth. He hesitated only for a heartbeat. Then he reached inward. The shard erupted. Light exploded from his chest, a burst of searing green that filled the chamber, turning shadows into screaming shapes. The braziers shattered, warp flame pouring across the floor in rivers of molten fire. The council thrones blazed with light, the figures within them writhing as the energy coursed through their bodies. The air filled with the stench of burning fur and ozone. Warp lightning crackled from the ceiling, arcing between the pillars and across the thrones. One seer screamed as his body split open, his form twisting into a grotesque shape, horns lengthening, limbs doubling, skin peeling away in ribbons of light. Another burst apart entirely, his essence scattering like ash on the wind. Strike stood at the center of the storm, the shard's light pouring through his veins. His mind was aflame with visions, images of worlds burning, of tunnels collapsing, of armies of rats and greenskins marching together beneath a sky split by lightning. He felt everything. The pain of the dying seers, the terror of those who watched, the cold, exultant laughter of the gods. The shard's voices merged into one. It was no longer Gork or Mork, nor the Horned Rat. It was something beyond them, a unity born of war and madness. You are chosen, the voice thundered in his skull. You are the bridge between the divine and the damned. You are the Waaagh-Rat. The words shook him to his core. His body convulsed as energy tore through him. His flesh rippled, veins glowing like molten metal beneath his skin. He fell to one knee, clawing at the stone, his breath coming in ragged bursts. Around him the chamber continued to unravel, the obsidian walls cracking, runes flaring and dying in a haze of smoke. The surviving seers tried to retaliate. Bolts of warp lightning lanced toward him, but the shard absorbed them effortlessly, drinking the energy like water. Each strike only made him stronger. He rose again, eyes burning with the same green fire that filled the chamber. You wanted purity, he said, his voice resonating with something inhuman. You wanted faith. He spread his claws wide, and the power poured out of him in a wave that consumed the nearest thrones. The seers within them screamed as their bodies fused with their seats, turning to living stone. The light dimmed, flickered, then went out. Silence fell. Smoke hung in the air, thick and choking. The chamber was in ruins, the walls blackened, the floor slick with blood and molten glass. Only a handful of seers remained, huddled at the far edge of the room, their faces pale and shining with sweat. The Grey Seer, his old patron, stood among them, his staff clutched tightly, his composure shattered. "You fool," he whispered. "You've damned us all." Skritch turned toward him, the shard still glowing faintly beneath his chest. "No," he said quietly. "One set us free." The Grey Seer raised his staff, but before he could speak, the shard pulsed again, a single, slow heartbeat that filled the chamber. The light was softer this time, but deeper, heavier. It spread outward, through the walls, through the tunnels, through the Under-Empire itself. And within that light, Skritch heard it, the voice of the horned rat. Not distant, not imagined, but clear and resonant, as though the god stood beside him. "You think to wield my power," it said, the sound like claws scraping over stone. "But my power wields you. You are mine, as all things beneath are mine." Skritch fell to his knees, gasping, his vision blurring. The light flickered once more, then died, leaving only the faint hum of the shard and the echo of divine laughter fading into the dark. When he looked up, the council chamber was empty. The throne stood silent, the bodies gone. The only thing that remained was the smell of burnt stone and the echo of his name, whispered again and again from somewhere deep within the earth. Skritch rose slowly, his eyes glowing in the 1499 light. The council was gone. The gods had spoken, and the world below was no longer the same. Chapter 12. The Birth of Waaagh-Rat. The Underhive was no longer a city. It was a wound, a festering, living pit of filth and power that pulsed in rhythm with the heartbeat of something monstrous. The floodwaters had turned black, laced with veins of warpstone that glowed faintly in the dark. The air trembled with soundless vibrations, a low hum that wasn't quite mechanical nor entirely alive. It was as though the tunnels themselves were whispering, breathing, waiting. At their center stood Skritch Quickfang, the creature who had once been a rat-man, then something less, and now something far beyond. His body shimmered with unholy light, veins of warpstone tracing glowing paths beneath fur that had turned coarse and green-tinged. His eyes burned like twin lanterns, the pupils slitted, the whites shot through with veins of emerald. The shard had long since fused completely with his flesh. It pulsed within his chest like a living heart, the conduit between worlds. He could feel it all now, the power of the Waaagh, that primal force of rage and belief that boiled within every greenskin's soul, and the warp, the seething chaos of the Horn-Rat's dominion. They were no longer separate. Through him they had become one. The Waaagh fed the warp, and the warp twisted the Waaagh, creating something new, something endless. He felt every scream, every heartbeat, every vibration in the tunnels below. Every greenskin that roared, every Skaven that hissed, every hybrid creature that twitched and bled. They were part of him now. Their fury flowed through his veins, their hunger sharpened his thoughts. He had become the center of the storm. The tunnels echoed with the thunder of marching feet. Skaven and Greenskin, once enemies, now moved together, not in uneasy alliance but in a terrible unity. The squeak orcs had multiplied, breeding and mutating in the dark. Some were massive, hulking things with hides like bark and tusks made of warped bone. Others were wiry, twitching killers with fur as black as oil. Their eyes all burned with the same viridian glow, the mark of their shared origin. And there were new creations, too, birthed from the fusion of warpstone radiation and the orcs' fecund madness. Trolls whose teeth had become crystalline tusks that hummed faintly with energy. Rat ogres stitched with orcish muscle and crude armor, their faces a nightmare of fur and green skin. Even the air seemed alive, thick with spores that shimmered faintly with warp light. They gathered before him in the flooded halls of the old forges, their numbers stretching into the dark. The ceiling dripped, water falling in slow rhythmic drops that hissed when they hit the glowing sludge below. The light of 1,000 warp lanterns bathed the scene in eerie green luminescence. Skritch stood upon a platform of rusted metal, his claws outstretched. The shard within his chest beat faster, casting ripples of light across the cavern walls. His voice carried, amplified not by lungs or throat, but by the warp itself. "Rise," he said. The Horde roared. The sound was not a single voice, but 1,000, a tidal wave of noise that shook the foundations of the Underhive. The Greenskins bellowed their guttural war cries, the Skaven shrieked their chittering screams, and somewhere in between, the Squeak Orcs howled a sound that was both. The Waaagh energy flared in answer, a psychic storm that tore through the tunnels, warping metal and stone alike. Skritch felt it surge into him. The shard drank the power greedily, its light blazing until the metal of his armor began to glow red-hot. He didn't resist it. He let it flow, let it consume him. Every roar, every cry, every heartbeat became part of a single rhythm, one pulse, one heartbeat, one wish. The Waaagh-Rat was born. Lightning burst from the ceiling, arcs of warp energy tearing through the cavern. The glow of the shard spread outward, rippling through the ranks of the Horde. Skaven dropped to their knees, trembling, their eyes filling with light. Orcs bellowed in ecstasy, smashing their weapons together in a deafening rhythm. The air stank of ozone and burnt flesh. The ground shook as the first wave began to move. The Horde spilled through the lower tunnels like a living flood, devouring everything in its path. The old warrens of Clan Pestilence were the first to fall, their plague priests screaming prayers as they were swallowed by the tide. The pestilent fumes of their catacombs mixed with the warp-tainted air, turning the corridors into toxic fog. Skritch's creatures emerged from the mist, glowing with new mutations, skin blistered and eyes of flame. Further down, the remnants of Clan Mulder tried to contain the chaos, releasing their war beasts in desperation. For a moment, the tunnels became a slaughterhouse of claws and fangs. Rat ogres and troll rats tore into the Waaagh-Rat horde, but the Squeakworks fought with a strength born of pure fury. Every death only fed the shard. Every scream sent another pulse of energy into Skritch's veins. The battle became a ritual, a sacrifice of blood to the gods who now shared his body. Hours or days passed in a blur of violence. By the time silence fell again, the lower levels of the Underhive were gone, buried beneath a tide of corpses and shattered metal. The tunnels burned with warp fire, rivers of molten filth, flowing through them like veins of hellish light. Skritch stood atop a mound of bodies, his claws dripping with blood, the shard in his chest glowing so brightly it seemed to illuminate the world. Around him, his army chanted, a sound somewhere between prayer and madness. Waaagh-Rat, 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 Waaagh-Waaagh. The name spread like contagion, passing from mouth to mouth, echoing off the stone. It wasn't just his name anymore. It was a word of power, a curse, a prophecy. It filled the tunnels, the air, the blood of every living creature that heard it. Skritch looked upward. The air above was alive with light, the ceiling of the Underhive glowing faintly from the fires below. Beyond it lay the surface, the ruins of the old cities, the realms of men and elves and dwarfs. He could almost see it, feel it, taste it. The shard pulsed in agreement, its voice resonating through his mind. Upward, he turned to his horde, the fires reflected in their eyes, their claws dripping, their bodies trembling with the aftershock of victory. He raised one arm, and the roar that followed was deafening. The Waaagh-Rat began to march. They moved as one, a living engine of destruction. The tunnels trembled beneath their weight, dust raining from the ceilings as the old stone gave way. Every step they took was echoed by the distant rumble of collapse. They devoured the lower layers, consuming whatever still lived there. Vermin, beasts, mutants, even their own fallen. The air grew hotter, thicker, filled with the stink of decay and energy. As they climbed, the light grew brighter. The upper tunnels were narrower, lined with pipes and ancient rusting machinery. They smashed through it all, leaving ruin in their wake. Skritch walked at their head, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the surface. He could feel the shard pulling him upward, driving him towards something inevitable. He no longer thought of the Council, or of Grubnash, or of the past. Those were remnants of a smaller world, a world of clans and betrayals and ambition. He was beyond that now. He was no longer a Skaven warlock or a creature of the pits. He was the vessel of gods, the embodiment of hunger and faith and madness. Above him, the ceiling began to crack. Faint shafts of light pierced the dark, sunlight thin and weak but real. He raised his hand toward it, the shard's glow merging with the pale gold from above. The two lights twisted together, green and white, seething and brilliant. Behind him, the Horde roared again, the sound of 1,000 throats crying out as one. The Waaagh-Rat had risen, and the world above, still ignorant of what slept beneath its feet, trembled as the first crack of light met the green glow of the underworld. Chapter 13. The Surface Burns. The surface world had forgotten the Underhive, dismissing its rumbling and stench as the groaning of old earth, the settling of broken foundations. Mordheim had been dead for generations, a ruin haunted by ghosts, cursed by its own folly. Shattered towers jutted from the ash like jagged bones, their windows hollow and their stones slick with moss and corruption. The Wyrdstone comet that had fallen here centuries before still bled its poison into the soil, making the air shimmer faintly in the dusk. On that night the silence broke. The ground began to tremble. First a whisper, then a low moan, then a roar as the cracked streets split apart. From the depths came light, sickly green and raw, spilling out in molten veins. The earth itself screamed as something vast forced its way upward. And then they came. The Waaagh-Rat burst from the tunnels in a geyser of fire and filth. Skaven and Greenskin alike poured into the ruins, their claws and boots scraping against stones slick with centuries of decay. The first to emerge were the Orcs, furred, muscular brutes that shrieked in triumph as they clawed their way into open air for the first time. Behind them came the rat ogres and troll beasts, their eyes blazing with warp light, their bodies steaming in the cold night air. The streets filled with sound, the thunder of feet, the clash of crude weapons, the unending chorus of howls and screams. And at their head came Skritch Quickfang. He rose from the broken street like an unholy god, the shard in his chest blazing bright enough to drown the stars. His body was no longer his own. It had become an avatar of the power that consumed him. Fur and muscle flowed like molten metal, skin splitting and healing in waves as the warp surged through him. His shadow stretched across the ruined city like a living thing. The air around him shimmered with energy, the clash of the Waagh's psychic roar and the warp's endless hunger. He could feel them now, the gods. They were watching. Gork, or possibly Mork. The laughter of the twin deities thundered in his skull, deep and booming, rolling across the sky like distant thunder. Their mirth was cruel and joyous all at once, the laughter of war and victory, of endless senseless destruction. But above them all, beyond the veil of reality, another presence loomed. The air tore open like fabric as the horned rat's shadow stretched across the night sky, vast and impossible. Its form was not one of flesh, but of thought, a writhing shape made of green lightning and black smoke, its eyes twin voids that burned brighter than fire. It looked down upon Mordheim, upon Skritch, upon the merging of its dominions, and it smiled. The warp storm began to form. The sky churned, clouds spiraling inward, drawn into the center above the ruined city. Lightning crackled across the heavens, striking the towers and setting them ablaze. The Wyrdstone that still infested Mordheim's bones began to glow, its shards vibrating violently, responding to the shard's resonance within Skritch's chest. Every pulse of his heart sent ripples through the storm, bending the light, twisting reality. Below, the humans screamed. The scavengers of Mordheim, mercenaries, treasure seekers, witch hunters, and desperate souls, had come to the city for Wyrdstone. They had built camps in the ruins, fought skirmishes for shards of power, all believing themselves hardened survivors. They had faced mutants, beasts, and the walking dead. None had seen anything like this. The first to die were the outer patrols, the sentries perched atop ruined walls, cut down as the Waaagh-Rat burst through the ground beneath them. The explosion of filth and flame tore them apart in seconds, leaving only scorched bones. The scavenger camps were next. Fires spread, tents collapsing under the weight of beasts crawling from below. The humans fought back with black powder guns and holy fire, but the swarm was endless. Witch hunters, their black coats glinting in the firelight, formed firing lines in the central square. They shouted prayers to Sigmar, their voices drowned by the approaching roar. Blessed bullets tore through the first ranks of greenskins, bursting skulls and splattering green blood across the cobblestones. For a moment, it seemed they might hold. Then the sky split open. Warp lightning poured down from the storm above, striking the city in bolts of molten green fire. Buildings crumbled, streets melted. The air itself screamed as reality buckled. Skritch strode through the storm, every step leaving a trail of molten stone. His horde followed in his wake, unstoppable, unthinking. Orcs tore apart the witch hunters' line, their claws shredding armor as though it were parchment. Troll beasts slammed into walls and towers, bringing them down in showers of debris. Rat ogres fused with orcish flesh roared as they smashed through barricades, dragging survivors into the flame. The shard pulsed uncontrollably. Skritch's body convulsed as the power built, surging beyond his control. The laughter of the gods grew louder, echoing through his skull, filling his mind with visions. Empires burning, skies filled with fire, oceans boiling with corruption. The laughter was intoxicating, unbearable. He fell to his knees amid the carnage, his claws digging into the stone. The shard blazed white-hot, its energy spilling outward in visible waves. Around him, the ground cracked and split, weird stone shards rising from the soil like teeth. The warp storm above mirrored his pain, its eye opening wider until the stars themselves vanished behind the swirling vortex. He saw everything then. The horned rat, vast and eternal, coiling through the void like a storm-given form. Its eyes fixed on him, and for the briefest moment, Skritch felt seen. Not as prey, not as a servant, but as kin. "You have done well," the voice said. It wasn't sound. It was the grinding of worlds, the hiss of the warp itself. "You have broken the walls between them. My will spreads through you. The green gods roar because of you. You are mine, and mine alone." The shard flared in rebellion, the twin laughter of Gork and Mork echoing in defiance. "He's ours now, rat god," the booming voices bellowed. "You can't cage a Waaagh." The storm screamed. Lightning lashed downward, splitting the plaza in two. The Wyrdstone beneath Mordheim erupted, shooting geysers of glowing fragments into the air. The energy tore through both armies, mutating them as they fought, greenskins sprouting tails and extra limbs, Skaven growing tusks and green eyes. Flesh melted, reformed, and fused into new shapes that defied all understanding. The Horde had become a single organism now, bound by hunger and hate. It devoured everything it touched. Humans were dragged into the mass, their bodies consumed and remade in seconds. The ruins of Mordheim became a furnace of life and death, a living machine powered by faith and fury. Through it all, Skritch remained at the center, half-conscious, his body the bridge between gods. His fur stood on end, his claws sparking with energy. The shard's pulses grew faster, erratic, each beat threatening to tear him apart. He looked up into the storm and saw the three faces above, the laughing orc gods, the leering horned rat, and something else forming between them. A silhouette neither beast nor man, nor god. It was made of his image. He understood then. The Waaagh-Rat was not a name, nor a title. It was an idea. A new god born from the clash of belief and power. A creature of violence and evolution, of chaos made flesh. The shard burst open. The light that poured from him engulfed Mordheim, swallowing fire and shadow alike. For one eternal moment, the entire city glowed with blinding brilliance, a single, perfect instant of annihilation. The laughter of the gods merged into a single, shattering note. Then silence. When the light faded, Mordheim no longer existed as it had been. The ruins were gone, replaced by a crater filled with molten stone and fragments of Wyrdstone that pulsed faintly in the smoke. The air above shimmered with the residue of divine energy, and at its center, amid the burning remains of what had once been a city, Skritch stood alone. His body was scorched, cracked, and steaming, but he still lived. The shard within him beat slowly, weakly, like a heart waiting to awaken again. The horned rat's shadow receded into the clouds. The laughter of Gork and Mork faded into distant thunder. The sky was quiet. But beneath the silence, the world trembled. The Waaagh-Rat was loose upon the surface, and the age of gods made flesh had begun. Chapter 14. The Unholy Trinity. The ruins of Mordheim still burned, its blackened skeleton casting long shadows in the glow of the warp storm that churned above. The air was a furnace, thick with ash and the copper stink of blood. Every surface crawled with residual energy, the afterbirth of gods. Wyrdstone shards pulsed faintly in the cracks of shattered stone, like the heartbeat of a dying world. From the crater's depths, something stirred. Skritch Quickfang rose slowly from the molten filth, his claws gouging deep into the half-melted rock. His fur was gone, burned away in patches, revealing sinew that shimmered faintly with green light. The shard within his chest still pulsed, slower now, but each beat radiated waves of power strong enough to make the air tremble. His eyes were hollow embers, reflecting both exhaustion and revelation. He was alone, or so he thought. The first sound was a roar, deep and familiar, echoing across the smoldering plain. It rolled through the air like thunder, scattering the smoke, shaking loose chunks of debris from the ruined towers. It was not the mindless bellow of the Waaagh horde, nor the chaotic howls of the squeak orcs. It was a voice that carried will, rage, memory. Grubnash the Unkillable stepped through the haze, his silhouette framed by the burning skyline. He was larger than before, impossibly so. The warp had not destroyed him, it had reforged him. His flesh was cracked and glowing, his veins filled with molten Wyrdstone that pulsed beneath the skin like rivers of fire. Metal grafts jutted from his limbs, scavenged plates fused into the bone itself. His left arm was gone, replaced entirely by a construct of steel and sinew that hummed with unstable power. His face was half shadow, half hovering, and his eyes burned green. Between the two of them the air shimmered, a curtain of heat and power. The shard reacted instantly, its pulse growing faster, brighter. The light reached outward, flickering toward Grubnash like a desperate hand. Skritch felt it in his chest, the pull, the magnetic hunger. The shard wanted him. No, not him. Then the gods had spoken their will. The shard meant to unite them, two halves of a single monstrous creation, the true vessel of the Waaagh-Rat, a god made flesh, unstoppable, unending. But both refused. Grubnash spat, the sound sizzling against the molten ground. You stole my power, rat, my Waaagh, my strength. His voice was a thunderclap of hatred. One came to take it back. Skritch's claws flexed. It was never yours. You were only ever a fragment, the rage without the mind. One I am the bridge, the balance. Balance, Grubnash laughed, the sound echoing through the ruins. You're just a gnawing thing that bit off too much. His iron arm clenched with a metallic screech. Let's see if your gods bleed. The shard pulsed again, stronger this time, sending arcs of energy through the air. The two figures were drawn together like opposite poles of a magnet, their bodies sparking with violent static. The Wyrdstone veins in the earth flared bright, responding to the resonance. The ground cracked beneath their feet. And then they collided. The impact was cataclysmic. A shock wave tore through the ruins, toppling what little remained of Mordheim's spires. The air ignited, waves of green flame rippling outward in concentric circles. Where they met, reality twisted, stone turned to liquid, liquid to steam. Grubnash swung first, his iron arm smashing into Skritch's ribs with the force of an avalanche. The blow sent him hurtling through a collapsed wall, pulverizing the masonry. He hit the ground hard, but before he could recover, Grubnash was already on him, a mountain of muscle and hate. The orc brought his boot down, but Skritch rolled aside, claws slashing out in a blur of motion. Sparks flew as they raked across metal. They fought without hesitation, without words. It was not a duel. It was annihilation given form. Grubnash roared, bringing his arm down like a hammer. Skritch caught it, 1499's swing, claws sinking into the iron. The shard pulsed, and warp lightning burst from his body, arcing through Grubnash's frame. The orc convulsed, his flesh smoking, but his grin never faltered. He reached out with his remaining hand and seized Skritch by the throat, lifting him bodily from the ground. "Still think you're the master," he snarled, his grip tightened, crushing bone. Skritch's eyes flared, twin suns of emerald flame. "One am the conduit." He opened his jaws and screamed, a sound not of lungs, but of raw energy. The shard exploded outward, a column of blinding light that tore through the sky. The force blasted Grubnash backward, his body slamming into the ruins of a cathedral. The wall shattered around him, molten debris cascading like rain. The shard hovered between them now, freed from Skritch's body, suspended in mid-air. It pulsed violently, sending waves of heat and light across the battlefield. It was no longer a stone, but a heart, a beating, sentient organ of gods. Both figures turned toward it, their faces illuminated by its glow. The pull was unbearable. Skritch felt it clawing at his mind, at his soul, promising unity, eternity, divinity. He saw visions, the world remade in green fire, his horde spreading across continents, the skies torn open in worship of him. Grubnash saw the same vision, twisted by his own hunger, endless war, unending conquest, the laughter of Gork and Mork shaking the heavens. They both stepped forward. The shard shrieked. The sound split the air, a note so high and sharp it fractured glass and bone alike. The gods' laughter filled the world, overlapping, echoing. The ground trembled, the sky bled light. Then the shard struck. It lashed out with tendrils of energy, binding them both, The air filled with lightning and smoke. Their bodies were dragged together, the energy weaving their flesh into one. Skritch screamed as fur and skin began to melt, as the boundaries between them blurred. Grubnesh howled, his iron arm fusing to the shard's glow. The fusion began, two beings dissolving into a single, impossible shape. But Skritch fought back. He reached deep into himself, beyond the pain, beyond the gods' voices, into the one thing they could never own, his will. He had clawed his way up from the filth of the Under-Empire. He had survived the betrayal of his kind, the fury of Orcs, the judgment of gods. He would not surrender now. With a roar that shook the ruins, he drove his claws into Grubnash's chest. The shard's light flared brighter, as though in protest. The orc tried to resist, his strength immense, but Skritch's claws found their mark. He tore through muscle and metal, his hand closing around the molten heart beneath. The shard screamed. The fusion broke. The tendrils of light recoiled, snapping back like shattered nerves. Energy exploded outward, hurling both combatants apart. Grubnash crashed against the cathedral's remains, his chest torn open, the Wyrdstone veins flickering erratically. He tried to rise, his grin still defiant even as his flesh began to crumble. Skritch staggered toward him, barely standing, his own body a ruin of burns and light. "You can't kill me," Grubnash rasped. 1,000, unkillable." Skritch raised his claws, the shard's light blazing once more within his chest. "Then stay dead." He thrust his hand forward. The shard released a final surge of power, a beam of concentrated warp fire that struck Grubnash square in the heart. For an instant the world went silent. No sound, no motion. Then Grubnash exploded in a storm of green and white light. The shockwave flattened everything around them. The cathedral disintegrated. The crater deepened. The sky screamed. When the light faded, only Skritch remained. He fell to his knees amid the ruin, smoke rising from his body. The shard's light was 1499 now, but alive, its pulse erratic, unstable. He looked down at his hands, at the cracks running along his arms, glowing faintly like molten veins. His flesh was dissolving, consumed from within. The shard had chosen him as its vessel, but it was too much, too vast, too alive. It was feeding on him now, devouring him cell by cell. He could feel his mind unraveling, his thoughts slipping away like water through a sieve. The gods' voices returned, no longer laughter but whispers. "You are ours," they said together, "and through you the world will burn." He screamed, his voice echoing across the wasteland, half in pain, half in triumph. The ground beneath him split, light pouring from the cracks like the blood of creation. And as the warp storm overhead descended, swallowing the ruins of Mordheim in fire and shadow, Skritch Quickfang, warlock, outcast, conqueror, was no longer a creature of flesh. He became the storm. Chapter 15. The Hook Uncoils. The storm had quieted. Where Mordheim once stood, there was now only a wound, a hollowed crater several miles wide, its edges slick with melted glass and stone. The air above shimmered with strange light, a faint green haze twisting through the smoke like living mist. Everything within that circle had been reduced to ash and silence. No movement, no breath. Only the distant hum of energy still bleeding from the heart of the ruin. At its center lay Skritch Quickfang, or what was left of him. His body was broken beyond recognition, half skeletal, half crystalline. Shards of his own flesh glowed faintly, threads of warp light pulsing beneath skin that cracked with every shallow breath. The shard still burned in his chest, though its brilliance had dimmed. Its rhythm was erratic now, less the steady beat of a heart, and more the dying flicker of a dying star. He lay sprawled in the molten dust, eyes unfocused, staring at a sky that no longer seemed entirely real. The warp storm above churned with strange color, green and violet and black, folding into itself like a great cosmic wound. The air still thrummed with power, and through it all, faint whispers drifted like the echo of distant laughter. The shard pulsed again, stronger this time, as if aware of its host's fading life. It sent a ripple through the ground, a heartbeat that made the cracked stone vibrate. The earth around Skritch trembled softly, answering its call. Then came footsteps. They were soft at first, deliberate and unhurried. The sound of claws on glass, the whisper of robes brushing against scorched earth. A tall figure emerged from the haze, its silhouette framed by the sickly glow of the storm. The figure's horned shadow stretched long across the ruin, distorted and monstrous. The gray seer had returned. His robes were tattered from travel, his fur matted with soot and dust, but his posture was unbroken, tall, composed, unafraid. His staff gleamed faintly in the light, its tip crowned by a small sphere of captured warp energy that pulsed in time with the shard's fading glow. His eyes, twin slits of pale green, fixed upon the dying figure before him. "Skritch Quickfang," he murmured, his voice carrying easily across the still air. "How fitting that it ends here, where so many beginnings died." Skritch turned his head weakly, his jaw trembling as he tried to form words. His throat was raw, his voice little more than a rasp. "You..." The seer smiled faintly. Of course one knew. He stepped closer, his claws clicking against the molten ground. 999 you. Truly think the Council's judgment was surprise? That your rise, your defiance, your abomination of faith went unnoticed? He crouched beside Skritch, his long fingers tracing the cracks in the creature's ruined chest, stopping just above the glowing shard. "You were always meant to find it," he whispered. "That shard you clutched to your heart, it was no random gift of fate. It was a fragment of an old dream. One of ours." Skritch's eyes widened. The shard pulsed faintly, reacting to the seer's touch. "Yes," the seer continued, voice soft and measured. "Long before your time, before the comet fell and Mordheim choked on its own poison, Clan Skryre reached too far. We sought to harness both the warp's infinite hunger and the Waagh's impossible momentum, to merge raw chaos with belief, the energy of gods and the madness of beasts. It was called the Warp Waaagh engine, the first and last of its kind." He paused, glancing skyward as the storm shifted, lightning crawling through the clouds like veins. It was supposed to reshape the world. Instead, it tore itself apart, scattered into fragments, hidden in the places where gods go to die. Most forgot it ever existed. He looked down again, eyes glinting. "But the Horned One does not forget." Skritch tried to move, his claws scraping weakly against the ground. "You used me," he hissed, his voice barely more than a whisper. "It meant my mate breakfast." The seer tilted his head. "No. The Horned One used you. One merely obeyed." He reached into his robes and drew forth a shard of cracked glass, a recording crystal, faintly glowing. Images shimmered across its surface, laboratories filled with Skaven engineers, chained greenskins screaming as lightning danced across their bodies, a vast chamber lined with rooms that pulsed with both Warp and Waaagh energy. The forgotten experiment reborn. Every step, every failure, every act of rebellion was necessary. The seer said, his voice almost tender. "You proved what the old masters could not, that faith and fury can coexist, that the Warp can believe and the Waaagh can think. You made their dreams flesh." He reached out and brushed the shard embedded in Skritch's chest with one claw. The light flared instantly, too bright to look at. Skritch convulsed, the remnants of his muscles tightening as the shard responded to the seer's presence. "You were the prototype," the seer murmured, "the first successful vessel. But all prototypes break in the end." Skritch's breath came in ragged gasps. His body trembled as the shard began to vibrate violently, its light swelling until it filled his chest cavity entirely. The air hummed with power again, faint cracks of lightning snapping across the ground. The seer rose slowly, his robes fluttering in the charged wind. "The Horned One will be pleased," he said. "He desired proof that divinity can be engineered, that chaos can be guided, and now, thanks to you, he has it." Skritch's voice was barely audible. "You won't control it." The seer smiled, the expression cold and thin. "Control is an illusion. We need only point the storm in the right direction." The shot screamed. It split open, light spilling from Skritch's chest in a torrent of green and gold. The sound that followed was like the tearing of worlds, high, sharp, infinite. The air bent, reality itself rippling. The corpse beneath the light disintegrated, flesh turning to dust, bone to smoke. The shard hovered in midair, suspended between them, pulsing faster and faster. The seer lifted his hand. The light faltered, then moved toward him, slow at first, then swift, drawn like a moth to a flame. The shard settled into his open palm, its glow dimming to a steady pulse. He regarded it in silence for a moment. Then it whispered. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, like the rustle of dry leaves in the dark. But it was there, the same murmur that had once haunted Skritch's dreams, the same words that had called him from the filth of the tunnels. "You are chosen." The seer's eyes flickered. His claws closed gently around the shard. "Yes," he murmured. "No." He turned and began to walk toward the edge of the crater. Behind him the air shimmered, the remains of Skritch's body dissolving into motes of light. The warp storm above had begun to calm, its vortex shrinking into a narrow spiral that hung directly over the crater's heart. But within that dying storm shapes still moved, shadows of horned rats, or perhaps something larger, watching, waiting. As the seer ascended the slope, the shard pulsed again, stronger this time. The whisper grew clearer, more insistent. Hunger. Rage. Faith. Build again. He paused, glancing down at his hand. The shard's veins pulsed like a living thing. For the briefest moment he thought he saw movement within it, a reflection of something vast and green. Laughing. The seer smiled faintly. Yes, again. He reached the rim of the crater, his figure silhouetted against the 1499 horizon. The ruins of Mordheim smoldered behind him, a city erased from history. The shard in his hand flared once more, its glow spilling across his fur and face. Far above, the warp storm pulsed in answer, a ripple of green lightning streaking across the heavens. And somewhere in the depths of the warp, the horned rat stirred, not in anger, not in surprise, but in satisfaction. A new god had been tested. And the weapon had worked. The seer turned his gaze northward, where the night was darkest, and the sky whispered of empires yet untouched. The shard whispered again, softer now, almost affectionate. Rise, builder of faith and ruin. There is still work to do. The gray seer's smile widened as he vanished into the smoke. Behind him, the crater began to hum, faint, rhythmic like the beat of a heart,